The moment the bay horse pressed its forehead against Miguel's ghostly palm in that damp cave by the riverbank, three souls simultaneously found the redemption they had long sought, and Pastor John understood he had witnessed a silent miracle woven not by spectacular divine intervention, but by the compassionate persistence of a heart that refused to give up faith, even when pain seemed greater than any hope. But to understand how that transcendental moment became possible, we must go back 3 months, when the morning mist didn't yet carry the weight of the mystery that would forever change the small rural community of Oakhaven. John awoke as always before sunrise, driven by the sacred routine he had embraced for over 20 years, traversing the dirt roads, visiting the scattered cabins, bringing comfort to the afflicted and words of hope to those who had lost faith in tomorrow. He was a man of medium height, his hands calloused from working the land, and his eyes shining with the serenity of someone who had found their calling early in life. The son of farmers, John intimately knew the hardships that plagued these simple folks, the drought that killed the crops, the diseases that decimated the livestock, the constant feeling of abandonment by the distant powers of the capital city. But he also knew the quiet strength of these souls, the ability to resist and begin again that sprang from genuine faith, not the performative kind displayed in the pulpits of big cities. That autumn morning, as he walked among the trees still covered in dew, John felt a different unease in his chest. He couldn't quite name it, but there was something in the air that told him the day held surprises. The birdsong seemed sharper, the wind whispered secrets among the leaves, and even the neighbors' chickens clucked with unusual urgency. "Lord," John murmured, kneeling before the altar, "what happened here? What pain was so great that it broke a man's faith?" That's when he heard a whinny from outside. He ran to the window and saw the horse rearing, stamping its hooves on the ground agitatedly. Following the direction of the animal's gaze, John noticed something that had gone unnoticed in the first observation. One of the floorboards in the main bedroom was slightly out of place. Driven by an intuition he couldn't explain, John lifted the board and found a diary. The pages were charred at the edges, as if they had survived some fire, but much of the content was still legible. Miguel's neat handwriting revealed the progression of his pain. March 15th. 2 years have passed, but the pain remains as fresh as on the first day. I pray the Rosary 5 times a day. I implore the Blessed Mary to intercede for their souls, but the silence of heaven is deafening. April 23rd. I've started to question whether God really exists, or if we are just lost ants in an indifferent universe. Father Anthony says it's blasphemy, but how do you explain that innocent children die while criminals prosper? June 12th. I had a terrible dream. I saw my wife and daughter calling me from the other side of the river, but when I tried to cross, the waters turned to blood. I woke up screaming. The horse Lazarus was restless in the pasture, as if he had felt my despair. John stopped at the last entry, dated exactly 3 months ago. The pain that corrodes me is greater than salvation itself. Today I will surrender my soul to whomever wants to take it. May God forgive my weakness, if he even cares about the prayers of a desperate man. Lazarus, John said aloud, and immediately heard a whinny in response from outside. So that's your name, my friend? The pastor left the house with a heavy heart, carrying the diary like a sacred relic. Lazarus, his horse, waited with an uncanny calm, as if knowing a crucial piece of the puzzle had been found. John mounted, and following an impulse that sprang more from his heart than his head, let the animal choose the way back. To his surprise, Lazarus didn't take the trail back to John's property, but headed towards the river, along a barely perceptible path winding between ancient trees. The pastor didn't interfere, sensing he was being guided by a force beyond his understanding. The river in that area was wider and deeper, its dark waters reflecting the gray sky like a melancholic mirror. Lazarus stopped at the bank and began to dig the ground with his hooves, in an agitation that seemed to communicate urgency. John dismounted, and following his intuition, began to dig at the spot indicated by the animal. It didn't take long to find something, a rusty chain, buried shallowly, with some links broken as if it had been violently torn. Attached to the chain were more rosary beads, these completely blackened by moisture and time. Miguel was here, John said, more to himself than to the horse. This was his last stop before what? The answer came in the form of footprints mixed with hoofprints, still visible in the dry mud of the bank, leading to a rocky outcrop, half hidden by vegetation. John followed the trail until he discovered the entrance to a small cave, concealed beneath the bank. The interior was damp and dark, lit only by the filtered light entering through the opening. Constant drips created an aquatic symphony that echoed through the stone walls. And there, at the back of the cave, in a pool of flowing water springing from some subterranean source, John found what he was looking for, the final beads of Miguel's rosary, still gleaming, despite the dampness. It was at that moment that he understood the truth. Miguel hadn't drowned in the river, as many believed. He had found refuge in that cave, living as a desperate hermit, sustained perhaps by the spring water and the wild berries of the region. But why wasn't Lazarus with him? Why was the horse wandering alone in the woods? The answer came that same night, when John returned to his property with more questions than answers. While caring for Lazarus in the barn, offering feed and fresh water, he noticed that the animal seemed divided between two loyalties: the growing affection he showed for John, and a constant restlessness that made him look towards the river. "You know where he is, don't you?" John asked, stroking the horse's mane. "But something prevents you from staying with him." As if perfectly understanding the question, Lazarus rested his head on John's chest in a gesture that spoke of gratitude and trust. But in the animal's eyes, the pastor saw a deep sadness, the pain of someone who loves someone who has become unreachable. In the following days, John established a routine that combined his pastoral duties with the investigation of Miguel's mystery. Every morning, after visiting his parishioners, he returned to the cave with basic supplies: bread, water, fruit, which he left at the entrance. He never saw Miguel, but the food always disappeared during the night, confirming that the man was alive and feeding himself. Attempts at verbal communication were fruitless. John called Miguel's name, spoke about Lazarus, recited familiar prayers, but never obtained a response. It was as if the man had built an invisible barrier between himself and the world, a wall of grief that even genuine compassion couldn't penetrate. It was Mrs. Margaret who suggested a different approach. One afternoon, when she visited John to inquire about the progress of the investigation, she observed Lazarus grazing in the small field behind the house and made an observation that would change everything. "John, have you noticed how restless this horse gets every night? Yesterday I passed by here on my way back from town and saw him awake, looking towards the river. It's as if he has an appointment he can't keep. I've noticed, yes, he knows where Miguel is, I'm sure, but something prevents him from going there. What if it's not something but someone? What if Miguel himself is sending the horse away?" Margaret's suggestion made perfect sense. A man consumed by guilt and despair might believe he didn't deserve even the company of his faithful horse. Perhaps Miguel was punishing himself with total isolation, pushing away even the creature that could offer comfort in his solitude. "But how do we break down that barrier?" John asked. "With patience and faith, and maybe letting Lazarus himself show the way." This conversation became the turning point in John's strategy. Instead of trying to force a meeting with Miguel, he decided to focus on restoring the bond between the man and his horse. He began to take Lazarus to the vicinity of the cave, but without insisting on an immediate approach. They would stay there, pastor and horse, in contemplative silence, offering a peaceful presence that didn't demand a response. Gradually, he began to notice signs that the strategy was working. The footprints in the mud near the cave became more frequent, as if Miguel were venturing out more regularly. The food left at the entrance was consumed more quickly, suggesting that the man was regaining his appetite. And one morning, John found something new: a small cross made of dry branches, carefully placed on the rock where he usually left the supplies. "He's trying to communicate," John said to Lazarus, who watched the cross with intense attention. "It's a sign that there's still faith somewhere in his heart." For those who follow these stories of faith and hope that emerge from the most unexpected places, it's worth remembering that miracles like this happen every day around us. We just need to be mindful of the signs. If you want to continue receiving touching stories like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because each story we share carries a valuable lesson about the transformative power of human compassion. Progress, however, was slow and demanded a patience that tested even John's robust faith. There were days when he arrived at the cave and found the food untouched, suggesting that Miguel had retreated again into the depths of his grief. Other times, he discovered small objects, a wild flower, a stone smoothed by the water, a piece of carved wood, that seemed to be offerings or attempts at communication. Lazarus in turn demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of the process. When Miguel seemed more receptive, the horse would approach the cave entrance and whinny softly, as if calling to a dear friend. When he sensed that the man had withdrawn, he kept a respectful distance, limiting himself to grazing nearby, with a patience that spoke of unconditional love. The definitive transformation began on a full moon night, when John decided to break his own routine. Instead of returning home after leaving the supplies, he set up camp in a clearing near the cave, determined to keep watch. Lazarus grazed calmly beside him, as if fully approving of the decision. Around midnight, John heard noises coming from the direction of the cave. Cautious footsteps, the rustling of clothes against the rocks, heavy breathing from someone who hadn't exercised properly for a long time. He remained motionless, feigning sleep, while observing through half-closed eyelids. The figure that emerged from the cave was almost unrecognizable as the man from the photographs found on the farm. Miguel was thin and bearded, wearing clothes that had once been white but were now the color of the earth. His hair, once well-groomed, fell over his shoulders in unkempt strands, but it was his eyes that were most striking, deep-set, haunted, burdened by a pain that seemed to have become physical. Miguel approached the supplies with careful movements, like a wild animal checking for danger. It was when he saw Lazarus that he stopped completely, his body tense as a stretched string. The horse in turn raised its head, and they looked at each other across the distance that separated them, a distance that was far more emotional than physical. "Lazarus," Miguel murmured, and John felt a shiver as he heard that hoarse voice, broken by disuse and pain. "You shouldn't be here, my friend. You shouldn't be tainted by my damnation." The horse took a step toward the man, but Miguel recoiled, raising a hand in a gesture that asked him to stop. "No," he said, firmer now. "You are pure, innocent. I am a man who has lost the right to the company of good creatures. Go away, Lazarus. Find someone who deserves your love." It was then that John fully understood the tragedy unfolding before him. Miguel hadn't isolated himself merely out of despair, but because of a deep guilt that made him believe that his pain could contaminate everything he touched. It was a distorted form of protection, a sacrifice he imagined he was making out of love for his horse. John rose slowly, making enough noise to announce his presence without startling Miguel. The man cowered, clearly preparing to flee back to the cave, but something in the pastor's calm posture made him hesitate. "Miguel," John said softly, almost a whisper, "my name is John. I'm a pastor in the Oakhaven community. I found Lazarus a few weeks ago, wandering alone in the woods." "Go away," said Miguel, but without the strength he tried to put into the words. "Leave me alone." "Lazarus was wearing this when I found him," said John, taking the rosary from his pocket and holding it up for Miguel to see. Even in the pale moonlight, the white beads shone like small pearls. The effect was immediate. Miguel fell to his knees as if he had been dealt a physical blow, his hands outstretched toward the rosary, with a hunger that went beyond the physical. "Mary, protect us." John read aloud the inscription on the crucifix. "It was your prayer, wasn't it?" "It was my wife's," Miguel managed to say between sobs that seemed to tear his throat. "She prayed for our protection every night, but it didn't work, Pastor. The prayer didn't work." John approached slowly, as if he were handling a wounded animal. "Prayers don't always protect us from pain, Miguel. Sometimes, they protect us in the pain." "No," said Miguel, shaking his head violently. "God abandoned me. He let my family die while I slept. I didn't hear the screams, Pastor. I didn't hear my daughter's screams. And so you punish yourself, denying yourself even the company of Lazarus. He deserves better than a cursed man. It was then that Lazarus took the initiative. Ignoring Miguel's gestures of dismissal, the horse approached and, with almost human gentleness, nuzzled his muzzle against the man's wet face. Miguel tried to pull away, but the animal followed him, insisting on contact with a loving persistence that broke the man's last defenses. Lazarus, Miguel said, finally wrapping his arms around the horse's neck. My faithful Lazarus, how can you still love me after everything? Because true love isn't based on what we deserve, said John, offering the rosary to Miguel. It's based on what we are, simply for existing. Miguel took the rosary with trembling hands, pressing it to his chest as if it were a talisman against pain. I can't pray any more, Pastor. The words are lost along with my faith. Then let me pray for you, until you find your own words again. That night, under the silvery light of the full moon, 3 different beings, a wounded man, a compassionate pastor and a loyal horse, formed a circle of healing that transcended any formal ritual. John prayed softly, as Miguel wept tears he'd held back for months, and Lazarus stood close by, offering the silent comfort of his presence. The recovery process was gradual, like the sunrise. Miguel didn't immediately return to the world. Instead, John established a routine of daily visits that included careful conversations, shared meals, and most importantly, moments of silence where the man could process his grief without pressure to heal faster than was natural. Lazarus became the group's true therapist. The horse seemed to instinctively know when Miguel needed company, and when he needed space, when a comforting touch would be welcome, and when respectful silence was more appropriate. Gradually, man and animal re-established the connection that had been severed by guilt and despair. It took 3 weeks for Miguel to feel ready to leave the cave and return to the farm. John accompanied him on this symbolic journey, knowing that each step represented a victory over the inner demons that had kept the man prisoner of his own pain. The property, of course, still showed signs of neglect, but now it seemed more like a promise of a new beginning than a tomb of memories. Miguel walked slowly through the rooms, touching dust-covered furniture, looking at photographs he hadn't been able to face for months. They wouldn't want to see me like this, he said, referring to his wife and daughter. They wouldn't want to know I gave up living because of their deaths. Grief is a form of love, John replied, but when grief prevents us from honoring those we've lost by continuing to live, it becomes a prison. Miguel spent his first night home in over 3 months sleeping on the living room couch, with Lazarus grazing outside the open window. It was a restless sleep, punctuated by nightmares and sudden awakenings, but for the first time in a long time, it wasn't a lonely sleep. The rebuilding of Miguel's life was a joint project. John helped repair the fences and clean the house, while other members of the community, initially skeptical but gradually touched by the story of redemption, offered their own kinds of support. Mrs. Margaret brought home-cooked meals and her practical wisdom about coping with grief. The local carpenter helped fix the broken windows. The rural school teacher offered books and conversations about subjects that didn't involve loss or suffering. But the real turning point came when Miguel decided to rebuild the small family chapel. Instead of trying to recreate exactly what had existed before, he chose to create something new, a space that honored his memories without being dominated by them. I want it to be a place of gratitude, he told John as they cleared the debris from the old altar, not just of requests and lamentations, but of gratitude for the years we had together. John watched Miguel work with a dedication that spoke of renewed purpose. The man had lost weight during the months of isolation, but his movements now had a firmness that had been absent since their reunion in the cave. Lazarus remained close throughout the work, as if knowing his presence was an essential part of the healing process. The new chapel was built on the same site as the old one, but with significant differences. Instead of the somber images of suffering saints that had dominated the previous space, Miguel chose more joyful representations of faith. Saint Francis conversing with the birds, the Virgin Mary smiling at the baby Jesus, Saint Benedict blessing the animals. In the center of the altar, he placed the restored Rosary, its beads now clean and polished, but retaining the marks of time as a testament to a faith that had survived the ultimate test. This Rosary, Miguel said, holding it up to the light coming through the chapel window, went through water, mud, despair, and yet it hasn't lost its essence. I hope I haven't lost mine either. Miguel's transformation didn't go unnoticed by the community. Initially, there was distrust. Some people believed that a man who had abandoned God couldn't simply return to faith as if nothing had happened, but the evidence of genuine change was impossible to ignore. Miguel began attending the Sunday masses that John celebrated at the small church in Oakhaven. His initial presence was timid, always in the back pews, but gradually he integrated into the community in a way that surprised even John. The man who had questioned God's existence now offered comfort to the bereaved, sharing his experience that it was possible to survive the most devastating loss. The pain doesn't go away, he told those facing their own tragedies, but it transforms. It ceases to be a destructive force and becomes a source of compassion for others who suffer. Lazarus, naturally, became a constant presence in these interactions. The horse seemed to have developed a special sensitivity for detecting people in distress, approaching them with the same gentleness he had shown during Miguel's recovery. Orphan children found solace stroking his mane. Widows found peace walking beside him through the fields. Men who had lost their jobs found hope in the animal's serene presence. Lazarus is a four-legged pastor, Mrs. Margaret joked, but there was profound truth in her words. The horse had become a living symbol that loyalty and love could overcome any adversity. 6 months after their reunion in the cave, Miguel made a decision that surprised everyone, including John. He announced that he intended to transform part of his property into a refuge for people going through spiritual or emotional crises. Not a hospital or clinic, he explained during a community meeting, but a place where people can come when they need time and space to reconnect with themselves and their faith. A place where they can work the land, care for animals, and find healing through simplicity. The idea was met with growing enthusiasm. Other community members offered help. The carpenter volunteered to build simple cabins for visitors. The school teacher offered to create a library of inspirational books, and the doctor from the neighboring town agreed to make regular visits. John saw in the project something bigger than a simple community initiative. It was the realization of the truth he had learned throughout his journey, that healing rarely comes through isolation, but through connection with other beings, human and animal, who share the fundamental experience of being alive and vulnerable in a world often difficult to understand. The refuge opened in early autumn. The first guest was a young man from the capital city who had lost his faith after his family business went bankrupt. He arrived grumpy and suspicious, but after a week helping Miguel fix fences and talking with John about the complexities of faith in modern times, he began to show signs of finding a new perspective on his problems. "Here, you don't try to convince me of anything," he said on one of the last nights of his stay. "You just show me that there's a different way to live, a way that doesn't depend on external success or failure." Lazarus, naturally, played his part in the young man's recovery. In the first few days, the young man completely ignored the horse, focused only on his own bitterness, but gradually, the animal's patient presence began to open spaces in his defensiveness. On the last morning of his stay, John found the young man in the pasture, arms around Lazarus's neck, weeping tears that seemed to wash away a very old pain. The initiative's success brought visitors from increasingly distant regions. Women who had lost children came, men facing painful divorces, teenagers struggling with addiction, and elderly people feeling abandoned by their families. Each brought their own version of human suffering, but all found in the simplicity of rural life and the silent wisdom of the animals, a way to begin healing. Miguel developed a unique approach for each visitor. With some, he worked in the garden, letting the earth absorb their tears, and the natural rhythm of plant growth teach about patience and rebirth. With others, he walked through the fields, talking about faith in a way that didn't require specific beliefs, but only openness to the mystery of existence. And with those who were most wounded, he simply remained present, offering his own experience of suffering as proof that it was possible to survive the unbearable. "I'm not a therapist or a priest," he always said whenever someone tried to categorize his work. "I'm just a man who learned that our greatest strength doesn't come from the absence of pain, but from the ability to transform pain into compassion." John watched everything with a deep satisfaction that went beyond personal pride. He saw in Miguel's transformation and the birth of the refuge a confirmation that his own vocation had been lived correctly. For years, he had offered comfort to the afflicted through visits and prayers. Now, he witnessed the birth of something even greater, a healing community sustained by the collective strength of those who had chosen to transform their wounds into wisdom. The first anniversary of Miguel and Lazarus's reunion was celebrated with a special mass at the rebuilt chapel on the farm. People came from all the neighboring communities, many of them touched directly or indirectly by the redemption story that had begun with a lost horse and a rosary tied under its mane. During the ceremony, Miguel gave a speech that moved even the most skeptical. "A year ago, I was dead inside, convinced that God had abandoned me. Today, I know I was never alone. God spoke to me through Lazarus's faithfulness, through Pastor John's compassion, through the patience of this community, welcomed me back even when I had lost faith in myself. I learned that miracles aren't always extraordinary events that defy the laws of nature. Sometimes, they are simply the result of hearts that refuse to give up on each other." Lazarus, throughout the speech, remained beside Miguel, as he had done during the darkest moments, and now did during moments of joy. The horse had aged a little during that intense year, but his eyes retained the same wise serenity that had won John's heart that first morning in the woods. After the Mass, as the guests shared a community meal in the farm's gardens, John found himself alone with Lazarus in the pasture. The horse was grazing peacefully, but raised his head when he noticed the pastor's approach. "You knew, didn't you?" John said, stroking the animal's neck. "From the first moment, you knew I was the right person to help Miguel. That's why you appeared on my path that morning." Lazarus looked at him with those expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond human comprehension. Then, he gently rested his muzzle on John's chest, in a gesture that the pastor interpreted as mutual gratitude. "Thank you, my friend," John murmured, "for teaching me that faith is not measured by the absence of questions, but by the willingness to keep walking even when we don't have all the answers." The sun was setting when John finally prepared to go home. He looked one last time at the farm, now alive again with the sound of human voices and the laughter of children playing in the garden. Miguel was on the porch, talking animatedly with some of the refuge's visitors, and his face radiated a peace that had seemed impossible just a year before. On the way back, John reflected on all the lessons he'd learned during that extraordinary journey. It had begun as a simple act of compassion for a lost animal, and had transformed into a profound experience about the nature of faith, loss, redemption, and the connection between all living beings. He thought of Miguel, who had discovered that questioning God didn't mean losing him, but rather finding a more mature and compassionate faith. He thought of Lazarus, who had taught him about unconditional loyalty, and how true love doesn't give up even when temporarily rejected. And he thought of himself, who had learned that being a pastor meant much more than performing religious rituals. It meant being present in moments of crisis, offering not easy answers, but genuine companionship during life's most difficult journeys. The rosary he had found that first morning now rested on the altar of the rebuilt chapel,
its restored beads gleaming in the candlelight. But John knew that the real miracle wasn't in the object itself, but in the journey it had symbolized, a journey that had transformed 3 lives and touched an entire community. As he approached his own home, he saw that a light still shone in the kitchen window. Mrs. Margaret had promised to leave a warm dinner waiting for him, along with stories about other community members who had been inspired by Miguel's example to face their own difficulties with renewed courage. That night, before sleep, John said his usual prayer, but with words he had learned during the months he spent with Miguel and Lazarus. Lord, thank you for teaching me that your voice can speak through a lost horse, that your mercy can operate through broken hearts, and that your miracles happen not when the pain disappears, but when it transforms into a source of compassion for others. Help me to continue being an instrument of your peace, knowing that I will not always understand the paths you choose to guide us back to the light. And so, in the small rural community of Oakhaven, the legend of Pastor John, Lazarus, the horse, and Miguel the man continued to be told, passing from generation to generation as a powerful reminder that redemption is always possible, that true love never gives up, and that sometimes the deepest miracles happen not through spectacular supernatural interventions, but through the quiet persistence of human compassion, able to see beyond the surface of pain, and find, in the heart of every person, the divine spark that never completely extinguishes, even in the darkest moments.